Picture this. You're standing in front of Buckingham Palace, camera in hand, trying to get the perfect vacation photo. The royal guard stands perfectly still, like a statue carved from stone. You think to yourself, what would it take to make this guy move? Most tourists wonder. Some might whisper a joke or wave frantically. But what happens when someone takes it too far? What happens when a simple vacation prank spirals into an international incident that makes headlines around the world? This is the true story of Marcus Chun, a software engineer from California who thought he was just having harmless fun during his London vacation. In less than 30 seconds, his life changed forever. A single cup of coffee, one moment of poor judgment, and suddenly he found himself at the center of a media storm that would follow him across continents. Some mistakes you can laugh about later. Others haunt you for years. This is the story of how a tourist's prank became a nightmare that no amount of money, lawyers, or apologies could fix. Because when you mess with the Queen's Guard, you're not just disrespecting a person in a funny hat. You're challenging centuries of tradition, international protocol, and the very foundation of British dignity. What started as a vacation photo opportunity ended with diplomatic tensions, legal battles, and a man whose name became synonymous with the ugly American tourist. But the real story isn't just about what Marcus did that day. It's about what happened next, and how one moment of stupidity can unravel an entire life. The truth is stranger than fiction, and sometimes more terrifying than any movie. This is that truth. Marcus Chun had always been the type of person who planned everything down to the smallest detail. His friends called him obsessive, his colleagues called him thorough, but Marcus preferred to think of himself as someone who simply didn't leave things to chance. So when he finally decided to take his first real vacation in 3 years, every moment of his 2-week London trip was carefully mapped out in a color-coded spreadsheet that would have impressed even the most dedicated project manager. The irony wasn't lost on him that the most spontaneous moment of his entire life would also be the one that destroyed it. Marcus worked for a tech company in Silicon Valley, spending his days writing code for applications that millions of people used without ever knowing his name. He was good at his job, great even, but at 32, he was beginning to feel like his life was nothing more than an endless cycle of debugging, coffee runs, and progress meetings. His apartment was clean, his bank account was healthy, and his social life was virtually non-existent. The London trip was supposed to change all that, or at least give him some stories to tell when he got back. He had arrived at Heathrow on a Tuesday morning, jet-lagged but excited. The city stretched out before him like something from a movie, all red double-decker buses, and ancient buildings mixed with gleaming modern towers. His hotel was a modest place in Bloomsbury, nothing fancy but clean and well-located. Marcus had chosen it specifically because it was walking distance from most of the major tourist attractions he wanted to see. The first few days of his vacation went exactly according to plan. He visited the Tower of London, marveled at the crown jewels, and took a boat ride down the Thames. He ate fish and chips in a proper pub, visited 3 different museums, and even managed to catch a show in the West End. Every experience was carefully documented with photos and notes in a travel journal he had bought specifically for the trip. Marcus was methodical even in his tourism. He would wake up each morning at 7, have breakfast at the hotel, and be out exploring by 9. Each day had its own itinerary, complete with backup plans in case of rain or unexpected closures. His friends back home would have laughed at the detailed schedules he had created, but Marcus found comfort in the structure. It made him feel like he was making the most of his time and money. By Friday of his first week, Marcus was feeling more relaxed than he had in years. The constant stress of deadlines and deliverables had melted away, replaced by the simple pleasure of discovery. London was everything he had hoped it would be, and more. The city had an energy that was both ancient and modern, a sense of history that you could feel in every stone and street corner. That Friday morning, Marcus had planned to visit Buckingham Palace. It wasn't the most original tourist destination, he knew, but it was one of those things you simply had to do when visiting London for the first time. He had read about the changing of the guard ceremony and timed his visit to arrive early enough to get a good viewing position. The weather was perfect for sightseeing. The sun was shining, but it wasn't too hot, and there was just enough of a breeze to make walking comfortable. Marcus wore his usual vacation uniform, khaki pants, a polo shirt, comfortable walking shoes, and a small backpack containing his camera, water bottle, and guidebook. He looked exactly like what he was, an American tourist with too much planning and not enough spontaneity. The walk from his hotel to Buckingham Palace took him through some of London's most beautiful neighborhoods. He passed elegant Georgian townhouses, carefully maintained parks, and busy streets filled with people going about their daily lives. Marcus found himself taking photos of things that weren't even on his planned shot list, caught up in the simple joy of being somewhere new and different. As he approached the palace, Marcus could see that he wasn't the only one with the idea of getting there early. Crowds of tourists were already gathering along the fence, cameras and phones ready to capture whatever they could of British royal pageantry. The palace itself was impressive, though perhaps not quite as grand as Marcus had expected from photos. Still, there was something undeniably majestic about the building, with its perfect symmetry and imposing gates. Marcus found a spot along the fence with a decent view and settled in to wait for the ceremony to begin. He struck up conversations with other tourists, comparing travel plans and sharing recommendations. There was a family from Japan taking turns posing for photos, a group of elderly women from Australia who seemed to know everything about the royal family, and several other solo travelers like himself, all drawn to this iconic piece of British culture. As he waited, Marcus became fascinated by the royal guards who stood perfectly still at their posts around the palace grounds. He had seen them in movies and photos, of course, but witnessing their absolute stillness in person was something entirely different. They stood like statues, their red uniforms and tall black hats creating a striking visual against the gray stone of the palace. Marcus watched one guard in particular, a young man who couldn't have been much older than himself. The guard stood at perfect attention, his eyes fixed straight ahead, completely oblivious to the hundreds of tourists who pointed cameras at him, whispered comments, and occasionally tried to get his attention. Marcus found himself wondering what it would be like to stand there for hours, maintaining that perfect posture while crowds of strangers treated you like a living tourist attraction. The longer Marcus watched, the more impressed he became with the guard's discipline. People walked right up to the rope barriers, some getting close enough to touch the guard if they had wanted to. Children made faces, teenagers tried to make him laugh, adults posed for selfies with him in the background. Through it all, the guard remained perfectly motionless, as if he were made of stone rather than flesh and blood. Marcus began taking photos, first of the palace itself, then of the guards, then of the crowds of tourists. He was particularly fascinated by the way people interacted with the guards, or rather, tried to interact with them. It was like watching hundreds of people try to communicate with statues. Some tourists seemed frustrated by the guards' lack of response, as if they expected acknowledgement or reaction. Others treated it like a game, seeing how close they could get or how silly they could act without getting a response. As the morning wore on, and the crowds grew thicker, Marcus noticed that the atmosphere was becoming more carnival-like. What had started as respectful tourism was gradually turning into something closer to entertainment. People were becoming bolder in their attempts to provoke reactions from the guards. Someone started a rumor that if you could make a guard smile, you would get good luck for a year. Marcus didn't believe it, but he watched as tourist after tourist tried increasingly ridiculous things to get a response. Marcus had been planning to leave after taking his photos and maybe buying a souvenir from one of the nearby shops, but he found himself staying longer than planned, captivated by the strange social dynamics playing out around him. He was an observer by nature, someone who liked to watch and analyze human behavior, and this was like having a front-row seat to a fascinating anthropological experiment. Around noon, Marcus decided to take a break from the crowds and find some lunch. He had spotted a coffee shop a few blocks away that looked promising, and his stomach was starting to remind him that he had only had a light breakfast. The coffee shop turned out to be exactly what he was looking for, a cozy place with good Wi-Fi, strong coffee, and sandwiches that actually looked appetizing. Marcus ordered a large coffee and a sandwich, found a table by the window, and pulled out his travel journal to write down his thoughts about the morning. He was a note-taker by habit, someone who liked to process experiences by writing about them. As he wrote, he found himself thinking about the guards and their strange job of being living tourist attractions. It occurred to Marcus that the guards were probably the most photographed people in London, maybe even in all of Britain. Millions of tourists came to see them every year, and yet they couldn't acknowledge a single one. They were simultaneously the center of attention and completely isolated from it. Marcus found something both admirable and tragic about their situation. After lunch, Marcus decided to walk back toward the palace for one more look before continuing with his afternoon plans. He still had the Tate Modern on his schedule, followed by a walk across the Millennium Bridge and dinner in a restaurant his hotel concierge had recommended. But As he approached the palace gates, something felt different about the crowd. The morning's polite tourism had definitely evolved into something more aggressive. Marcus could see tourists pressing closer to the guards, calling out louder, and generally treating the whole situation more like a circus than a military ceremony. One group of college-aged kids was taking turns posing for increasingly ridiculous photos, each trying to outdo the others in terms of silliness. Marcus found himself feeling protective of the guards, though he couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was his natural tendency to sympathize with anyone who had to deal with difficult customers, something he understood from his years in tech support early in his career. Or maybe it was simply his respect for professionalism and discipline, qualities that he valued in his own work. As he watched the scene unfold, Marcus noticed that one particular guard seemed to be bearing the brunt of the tourist attention. He was positioned near a popular photo spot, and the constant stream of people trying to get reactions from him was becoming almost aggressive. Marcus could see the guard's jaw tighten slightly, the only sign that he was human rather than statue. That's when Marcus made his first mistake of the day. Instead of walking away and continuing with his planned itinerary, he decided to stay and see how the situation would develop. He told himself that he was just curious, that he wanted to see how professional the guards would remain under increasing pressure. But the truth was that Marcus was starting to feel like he was part of something, connected to this strange street theater in a way that his usual tourist activities hadn't provided. Marcus bought another coffee from a nearby vendor, telling himself that he would just finish his drink and then move on to the museum as planned. But as he sipped his coffee and watched the crowds, something began to shift in his thinking. The disciplined, methodical Marcus who had planned every moment of his vacation was starting to give way to someone else, someone who wanted to be part of the action rather than just observing it. He began to imagine what it would be like to be one of those tourists who tried to get a reaction from the guards. Not in a mean way, he told himself, but just as a harmless bit of fun. After all, thousands of people did it every day. It was practically part of the tourist experience. The guards were trained to handle it, and no one was really getting hurt. Marcus finished his coffee but found himself reluctant to throw away the cup. It was a large paper cup from a well-known chain, still warm in his hands. He stood there holding it, watching the ongoing circus around the guards, and feeling an unfamiliar urge to do something spontaneous. For once in his carefully planned life, Marcus wanted to be the person who acted instead of the person who watched others act. The guard who had been getting the most attention was still standing perfectly still, despite the increasingly bold behavior of the tourists around him. Marcus found himself admiring the man's discipline and wondering what it would take to break that perfect composure. Not that he wanted to break it, exactly, but he was curious about the limits of human endurance and professional training. As Marcus stood there with his coffee cup, watching the scene unfold, he had no idea that he was about to make a decision that would change his life forever. In his mind, he was just a tourist on vacation, someone who had always played by the rules and colored inside the lines. The idea that he was capable of creating an international incident would have seemed absurd to him. But sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary mistakes, and Marcus Chun was about to prove that in the most public way possible. What happened next would be debated, analyzed, and dissected by lawyers, journalists, and internet commentators for months to come. But in the moment itself, Marcus Chin's decision seemed to happen almost without his conscious participation, like watching someone else make a terrible choice while being powerless to stop them. The guard Marcus had been observing was named James Morrison, though Marcus wouldn't learn this until much later, when the man's name appeared in countless news articles and legal documents. James was 24 years old, had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 2 years, and took immense pride in his ability to maintain perfect composure under any circumstances. He had endured everything from screaming toddlers to drunk football fans without breaking his stance, and he considered his discipline to be unbreakable. On this particular Friday afternoon, James was dealing with what felt like an unusually aggressive group of tourists. Someone had started a social media challenge about getting reactions from royal guards, and the crowd seemed more persistent than usual in their attempts to provoke responses. James had been standing at his post for nearly 3 hours, and while his training had prepared him for the physical demands of the position, nothing could have prepared him for what Marcus was about to do. Marcus later claimed that he never intended for things to go as far as they did. In the dozens of interviews he would give over the following months, he consistently maintained that his plan had been simple and harmless. He would walk up to the guard, say something funny, maybe splash a tiny bit of coffee on the ground near the man's feet, and then quickly walk away. It would be a silly tourist moment, the kind of thing he could laugh about with his friends back home. The problem with spontaneous decisions is that they rarely go according to plan, especially when they're made by people who aren't used to being spontaneous. Marcus had spent his entire life thinking through consequences, analyzing risks, and making careful choices. But, standing there with his coffee cup, watching the ongoing spectacle around the guards, something inside him rebelled against his usual caution. The crowd had grown thicker as the afternoon progressed, with tourists pushing closer to the guards and becoming increasingly bold in their attempts to get reactions. Marcus found himself swept along with the movement of the crowd, carried forward by a mass of people all trying to get the perfect photo or video. Before he quite realized what was happening, he was standing just a few feet from James Morrison, close enough to see the barely perceptible tension in the guard's jaw. Marcus raised his coffee cup, telling himself that he was just going to pretend to drink from it while posing for a silly photo. But, as he lifted the cup toward his mouth, someone behind him bumped into his elbow. The sudden jolt sent coffee splashing forward, and Marcus watched in horror as the hot liquid arced through the air toward the perfectly uniformed guard. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. Marcus could see every drop of coffee as it flew toward James, could see the guard's eyes widen slightly as he registered what was happening. The coffee hit James squarely in the chest, soaking through his red uniform and splashing up onto his face. The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. For perhaps 3 seconds, nothing happened. James Morrison stood perfectly still, coffee dripping from his chin and staining his uniform, his eyes locked straight ahead as his training demanded. The crowd around them seemed frozen, hundreds of people suddenly, realizing that they had just witnessed something that crossed a line none of them had expected to see crossed. Then, James Morrison did something that no one, including Marcus, had anticipated. He broke. Not physically, though the hot coffee had certainly been unpleasant. James broke professionally, emotionally, and completely. 2 years of perfect discipline, of standing motionless while tourists treated him like a living statue, of maintaining dignity in the face of constant provocation, suddenly crumbled. James stepped forward, grabbed Marcus by the shoulders, and shouted words that would be replayed on news programs around the world for weeks to come. "What the hell is wrong with you?" James screamed, his carefully controlled military bearing completely abandoned. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Do you understand what this uniform means?" The crowd erupted. Cameras and phones appeared from every direction, dozens of devices recording the unprecedented sight of a Queen's Guard completely losing his composure. Marcus stood frozen, still holding the empty coffee cup, staring at the young man whose career he had just destroyed with a single moment of poor judgment. James Morrison was not just any guard. As Marcus would learn later, James was considered one of the most promising young soldiers in his regiment. He came from a military family, had dreams of advancing through the ranks, and had never received so much as a reprimand during his time in service. His perfect record was something he took enormous pride in, and, in the space of 30 seconds, Marcus Chun had obliterated it. What made the situation even worse was that James didn't stop at shouting. The months of suppressed frustration at being treated like a tourist attraction, combined with the shock and humiliation of being doused with coffee, caused something to snap inside him. James grabbed Marcus's camera, which had been hanging around his neck, and smashed it on the ground. Then, he shoved Marcus backward, sending him stumbling into the crowd of tourists who were frantically trying to capture every moment of the unprecedented scene. The other guards stationed around the palace faced an impossible situation. Their training told them to maintain their positions no matter what happened, but one of their colleagues was clearly in distress and potentially assaulting a civilian. Within minutes, palace security arrived, followed quickly by local police who had been stationed nearby for crowd control. Marcus found himself at the center of a rapidly escalating incident that seemed to be spiraling beyond anyone's control. Palace security officers surrounded him, demanding to know his name and nationality. Police officers were trying to separate James Morrison from the crowd, while also attempting to restore some kind of order to what had become a chaotic scene. Meanwhile, hundreds of tourists continued filming everything, many of them live-streaming the incident to social media platforms around the world. The questions came at Marcus in a rapid-fire sequence that left him feeling disoriented and panicked. What was his name? Where was he staying? Why had he thrown coffee at a guard? Was this some kind of protest? Did he have any accomplices? Marcus tried to explain that it had been an accident, that someone had bumped his elbow, that he had never intended for any of this to happen. But his explanations sounded weak even to himself, and the increasingly hostile expressions of the people questioning him made it clear that no one believed him. Within an hour, Marcus Chin's name was trending on social media. The videos of the incident had been shared thousands of times, with new footage appearing every few minutes as tourists uploaded their recordings. The hashtag #CoffeeGate began trending, and Marcus found himself being discussed, analyzed, and vilified by people around the world who had never heard of him an hour earlier. The immediate aftermath was a blur of confusion and escalating consequences. Marcus was taken to a police station for questioning, though he wasn't formally arrested at first. Palace officials demanded that charges be filed for assault and destruction of property. The U.S. Embassy was contacted, and suddenly, Marcus found himself dealing with diplomatic officials who made it clear that his actions had created an international incident. James Morrison, meanwhile, was facing his own crisis. The videos of his outburst were being shared just as widely as the footage of Marcus throwing the coffee. Military officials were forced to address the unprecedented situation of a Queen's Guard losing his composure so publicly and completely. James was immediately relieved of duty pending an investigation, his perfect record permanently tarnished by 30 seconds of human reaction to an inhuman situation. The media response was swift and merciless. News outlets around the world picked up the story, with headlines ranging from American tourist attacks Royal Guard to coffee chaos at Buckingham Palace. Marcus's photo, taken from his social media accounts, appeared alongside articles that painted him as everything from an entitled American tourist to a possible terrorist sympathizer. Marcus spent 6 hours in police custody, trying to explain over and over that the incident had been accidental. He told the story so many times that he began to doubt his own memory of what had happened. Had someone really bumped his elbow? Had he intended to splash coffee on the ground? Or had some part of him wanted to see what would happen if he crossed the line that thousands of other tourists respected? The police officers questioning Marcus were professional, but skeptical. They had seen the videos, and while the footage wasn't entirely clear about whether Marcus had been bumped or had thrown the coffee deliberately, the fact remained that he had approached a guard with a cup of hot liquid, and that liquid had ended up on the guard. Intent, they explained, could be difficult to prove either way. By evening, Marcus was released on his own recognizance, but his passport was confiscated pending further investigation. He was told that he could not leave the country while the case was being reviewed. What had started as a vacation had become an indefinite stay in a foreign country, with legal bills mounting and his reputation being destroyed in real time across the internet. Marcus returned to his hotel to find reporters waiting in the lobby. His room phone was ringing constantly, and his email inbox was flooded with interview requests, legal offers, and messages that ranged from supportive to threatening. He had become famous overnight, but for all the wrong reasons. The hotel manager, clearly uncomfortable with the attention Marcus's presence was bringing, suggested that he might want to find alternative accommodations. Marcus realized that his problems were just beginning. He was trapped in London, facing possible criminal charges, and watching his life fall apart from thousands of miles away from anyone who might help him. That night, alone in his hotel room while reporters camped outside, Marcus finally understood the full magnitude of what his moment of spontaneity had cost him. His job, his reputation, his freedom, and quite possibly his future were all hanging in the balance because of 30 seconds of incredibly poor judgment. He had wanted to be part of the action instead of just watching it, and he had gotten his wish in the worst possible way. The story was far from over. In fact, as Marcus would soon learn, the coffee incident was just the beginning of a nightmare that would follow him for years to come. The real consequences of his actions were still unfolding, and they would prove to be far more devastating than anything he could have imagined while standing there with that coffee cup in his hands that Saturday morning. Less than 24 hours after the incident, Marcus Chun had become one of the most recognizable faces on the internet. His LinkedIn photo was being shared alongside articles about American tourist behavior. His college graduation picture had been dug up by online investigators, and someone had even found his high school yearbook photo and posted it with mocking captions. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing far beyond the simple facts of what had actually happened at Buckingham Palace. Depending on which news outlet you followed, Marcus was either a spoiled American millennial with no respect for foreign cultures, a possible terrorist sympathizer who had deliberately attacked a symbol of British authority, or a victim of an overreacting security state that had blown a simple accident out of proportion. Marcus woke up in his hotel room to the sound of protesters outside. Through his window, he could see a small but vocal group of people carrying signs with messages like "Respect our guards" and "Deport the coffee terrorist." The protesters had apparently organized through social media overnight, and they were demanding that Marcus be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The hotel manager knocked on Marcus's door at 8 in the morning with an eviction notice. The constant media attention and the protesters outside were disrupting other guests, and the hotel could no longer accommodate him. Marcus had 2 hours to pack his belongings and find somewhere else to stay, assuming anywhere would take him. Finding alternative accommodation proved nearly impossible. Every hotel Marcus called either claimed to be fully booked or suddenly developed policies against accepting guests who were involved in ongoing legal proceedings. Finally, a small bed and breakfast in a suburb outside central London agreed to take him, though the owner made it clear that he would be expected to keep a low profile and avoid bringing any media attention to the establishment. Marcus's legal situation was becoming increasingly complicated. The initial charges being considered included assault, criminal damage, and public disorder. But, as the story gained international attention, additional complications arose. Some members of parliament were calling for Marcus to be charged under anti-terrorism legislation, arguing that any deliberate attack on royal security should be treated as a potential threat to national security. The British press was having a field day with the story. The tabloids in particular seemed to delight in portraying Marcus as the embodiment of everything wrong with American tourists. They dug into every aspect of his background, interviewing former classmates, colleagues, and even his elementary school teachers. Marcus learned about his own life from newspaper articles, as reporters uncovered details about his past that he had forgotten himself. One particularly damaging article revealed that Marcus had received a parking ticket outside a veterans' hospital 3 years earlier, somehow spinning this into evidence of his general disrespect for military personnel. Another article suggested that his decision to take vacation time during a busy period at work demonstrated his selfishness and lack of consideration for others. Every mundane detail of his life was being reinterpreted through the lens of the coffee incident. The American media response was almost as brutal. While some outlets focused on the potential overreaction of British authorities, others seemed eager to distance themselves from Marcus's behavior. Late-night talk show hosts made him the subject of their opening monologues, with jokes about ugly Americans and coffee-wielding tourists becoming viral memes. Marcus found himself caught between competing narratives that bore little resemblance to his actual experience. He wasn't the entitled millionaire that some articles described, nor was he the innocent victim that others portrayed. He was simply a man who had made a terrible decision and was now watching his life be reconstructed by people who had never met him. The legal costs were mounting rapidly. Marcus had been forced to hire a British solicitor, who in turn recommended a barrister who specialized in cases involving foreign nationals. The initial consultation alone cost more than Marcus typically spent in a month, and both lawyers made it clear that if the case went to trial, the expenses would quickly reach tens of thousands of pounds. Marcus's employer back in California was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. While they couldn't legally fire him for being involved in a legal proceeding, they made it clear that the negative publicity was affecting the company's reputation. Marcus was placed on unpaid administrative leave pending the resolution of his case, effectively ending his income while his expenses skyrocketed. The emotional toll was perhaps worse than the financial pressure. Marcus had never been a public figure, had never wanted to be famous, and the constant scrutiny was overwhelming. He couldn't leave his accommodation without being recognized and photographed. Strangers felt entitled to approach him on the street to share their opinions about his actions. Some were sympathetic, but many were hostile, and a few were genuinely threatening. James Morrison, the guard who had been at the center of the incident, was facing his own nightmare. His military career was effectively over, as the public breakdown had violated every principle of guard duty. The videos of his outburst had been viewed millions of times, making him almost as recognizable as Marcus. Unlike Marcus, however, James had the support of his regiment and the broader military community, who viewed him as a victim of an unprovoked attack. The British public's sympathy clearly lay with James Morrison. A crowdfunding campaign to support him had raised over £50,000 in just 2 days. Supporters praised his years of dedicated service and argued that his reaction had been entirely understandable given the provocation. James became a symbol of British dignity under assault from foreign disrespect. Marcus, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. His friends back home tried to be supportive, but the constant media coverage made normal communication nearly impossible. His phone number had somehow been leaked, resulting in a stream of calls from reporters, conspiracy theorists, and people who simply wanted to yell at him. He was forced to change his number twice in the first week after the incident. The U.S. Embassy was providing minimal assistance, making it clear that while they would ensure Marcus received fair treatment under British law, they could not and would not attempt to shield him from the consequences of his actions. The consular officer assigned to his case was professional but unsympathetic, clearly viewing Marcus as someone who had created his own problems through poor judgment. As the days passed, Marcus began to understand that his situation was not going to improve anytime soon. The media attention was not dying down as he had hoped, but actually intensifying as new angles and details emerged. Investigative journalists were digging deeper into his background, his family history, and even his college social media posts from a decade earlier. The legal process was moving slowly, as British authorities conducted what they called a thorough investigation. Marcus was required to report to police twice weekly, and his movements were being monitored. He felt like a prisoner in a country that had once seemed welcoming and friendly. The London he had fallen in love with during his first few days of vacation now felt hostile and alien. Marcus's savings were disappearing rapidly. The legal fees, accommodation costs, and daily expenses of living in one of the world's most expensive cities were draining his bank account faster than he had thought possible. His lawyers had warned him that if the case went to trial, he would need to pay additional costs that could easily exceed $100,000. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. Marcus had never dealt with clinical depression or anxiety, but the constant stress and public scrutiny were taking a serious toll on his mental health. He found himself unable to sleep, unable to eat regularly, and unable to concentrate on anything other than his legal situation. The confident, methodical person who had planned his perfect vacation was being replaced by someone Marcus barely recognized. Social media had become a particular source of torment. The hashtags related to his case were trending regularly, and Marcus made the mistake of reading the comments and discussions about his situation. The level of vitriol and hatred directed at him was shocking. People were making threats against his safety, sharing his personal information, and creating elaborate theories about his motivations that bore no resemblance to reality. Some of the online discussion focused on broader issues of American behavior abroad, with Marcus becoming a symbol of everything wrong with American tourists. Others debated the appropriateness of the British response, arguing about whether the punishment was fitting the crime. But, for Marcus, trapped in the center of it all, the abstract political discussions offered no comfort. His family back home was also suffering. His parents, who had always been proud of their successful son, found themselves fielding calls from reporters and dealing with neighbors who recognized their name from news coverage. His younger sister, who worked in public relations, had to explain to her employer why her last name was suddenly associated with an international incident. Marcus began to realize that even if he was ultimately cleared of all charges, the damage to his life was already extensive and possibly irreparable. His reputation, his career prospects, and his financial stability had all been severely compromised. The internet never forgets, and videos of the coffee incident would follow him for the rest of his life. The case was attracting attention from legal experts who debated the broader implications of prosecuting tourists for what some argued was essentially a prank gone wrong. Some prominent lawyers argued that the charges were excessive and that the incident should be handled as a minor civil matter rather than a criminal case. Others maintained that any attack on royal guards, regardless of intent, must be treated seriously to maintain the integrity of royal security. As Marcus entered his second week trapped in London, he began to understand that his nightmare was far from over. The legal process could take months to resolve, and even the best-case scenario would leave him financially ruined and permanently associated with one of the most embarrassing tourist incidents in recent memory. He had wanted adventure and spontaneity in his carefully planned life, and he had gotten both in the most devastating way possible. The worst part was the growing realization that none of this would have happened if he had simply stuck to his original plan, finished his coffee, and gone to the Tate Modern as scheduled. 30 seconds of poor judgment had created a crisis that was consuming his entire existence. With no end in sight. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus Chin's case finally moved from investigation to formal charges. The Crown Prosecution Service had decided to pursue charges of assault and criminal damage, though they dropped the more serious suggestions of terrorism-related offenses. For Marcus, this felt like a small victory, though his lawyers warned him that even these reduced charges could result in significant fines and possible imprisonment. The decision to proceed to trial ensured that Marcus's nightmare would continue for months rather than weeks. British legal proceedings moved slowly, and his trial date was set for nearly 3 months in the future. Marcus would have to remain in the UK throughout this period, effectively ending any hope of returning to his normal life in the near term. During this waiting period, Marcus's story began to evolve in unexpected ways. A documentary filmmaker named Sarah Matthews had been following the case and decided to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding the incident. Her investigation would eventually reveal details that challenged the established narrative and raised uncomfortable questions about the events at Buckingham Palace that day. Sarah Matthews was an experienced investigative journalist who had made her reputation exposing corruption and cover-ups in various British institutions. She became interested in Marcus's case not because she necessarily believed he was innocent, but because some aspects of the official story didn't make sense to her. Her initial research focused on the security camera footage from the palace, much of which had not been released to the public. Through Freedom of Information requests and her contacts within the police force, Sarah obtained additional video evidence that painted a more complex picture of what had happened that day. The footage showed that Marcus had indeed been bumped by another tourist just as he raised his coffee cup, supporting his claim that the incident had been accidental. More importantly, the videos revealed something that had been overlooked in all the initial reporting. James Morrison, the guard who had reacted so dramatically to being splashed with coffee, had been drinking alcohol during his duty shift. The security footage showed him consuming what appeared to be alcohol from a water bottle during his break, just an hour before the incident with Marcus occurred. This was a serious violation of military protocol and raised questions about whether his explosive reaction had been influenced by intoxication. Sarah's investigation also uncovered a pattern of similar incidents involving James Morrison that had been covered up by his superiors. While James had maintained a clean official record, several tourists had filed complaints about his aggressive behavior in previous months. These complaints had been dismissed or suppressed to protect the reputation of the Queen's Guard, but they suggested that James had been struggling with the pressures of his position long before Marcus arrived with his coffee. The revelations from Sarah's investigation created a new media storm, but this time the narrative began to shift. Questions arose about why the authorities had been so quick to prosecute Marcus while ignoring evidence of misconduct by the Guard. Some observers began to suggest that Marcus was being used as a scapegoat to distract from larger problems within the royal security apparatus. Marcus's legal team immediately seized on these new revelations. They filed motions demanding access to all security footage, James Morrison's personnel records, and documentation of previous incidents involving tourists and guards. The prosecution's case, which had seemed straightforward, suddenly became much more complicated. The British media, which had been largely hostile to Marcus throughout the ordeal, began to question their own coverage of the events. Several newspapers issued corrections or follow-up articles acknowledging that their initial reporting had been incomplete. The tabloids that had painted Marcus as a terrorist sympathizer now had to grapple with evidence suggesting he might have been the victim of an intoxicated guard's overreaction. James Morrison found himself in an increasingly difficult position. The crowdfunding campaign that had raised money for his support began to lose momentum as questions arose about his conduct. Military officials who had initially defended him were forced to distance themselves as evidence of his drinking and previous incidents came to light. Marcus, meanwhile, remained trapped in legal limbo, though the new evidence provided him with some hope that his case might finally receive fair consideration. His lawyers were cautiously optimistic that the charges might be reduced or dropped entirely, but they warned him that the legal system was slow to admit mistakes, especially in cases that had received so much public attention. The psychological toll of the extended ordeal was severe. Marcus had been living under constant stress for nearly 2 months, unable to work, unable to return home, and unable to plan for the future. He had lost significant weight, was suffering from chronic insomnia, and had developed anxiety attacks that left him unable to leave his accommodation for days at a time. His financial situation had become desperate. The legal fees alone had exceeded £40,000, and his living expenses in London were draining what remained of his savings. Marcus had been forced to sell his car and liquidate his investment accounts, and he was beginning to consider taking out loans against his apartment back in California. The strain on his family relationships was also becoming severe. His parents had initially been supportive, but the extended nature of the crisis was taking a toll on everyone. His father, who had always taught Marcus to take responsibility for his actions, struggled to understand how a simple accident had spiraled so far out of control. His mother worried constantly about his health and safety, calling multiple times each day to check on him. Marcus's former employer had officially terminated his employment, citing the extended absence and negative publicity as reasons for ending his contract. This meant that even if he was eventually cleared of all charges, he would return to California unemployed and financially devastated. His reputation in the tech industry had been severely damaged, and he doubted whether anyone would hire someone whose name was associated with international incidents and legal troubles. The trial, when it finally began, attracted massive media attention. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and members of the public who had been following the case. Marcus found the experience of being the center of such intense scrutiny almost unbearable. Every gesture, every expression, every word he spoke was being analyzed and reported by dozens of journalists. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the video evidence showing Marcus approaching the guard with a cup of coffee, and that coffee ending up on the guard's uniform. They argued that regardless of intent, Marcus had assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard and damaged government property. The prosecutor painted Marcus as a typical entitled tourist who thought the rules didn't apply to him. Marcus's defense team presented the new evidence about James Morrison's drinking and previous incidents, arguing that their client had been the victim of an overreaction by an intoxicated guard. They emphasized that the security footage clearly showed Marcus being bumped by another tourist, supporting his claim that the incident had been accidental. The testimony of other tourists who had witnessed the incident proved crucial. Several people came forward to testify that they had seen Marcus being jostled by the crowd, and that his reaction appeared to be one of genuine surprise and horror when the coffee splashed on the guard. Their accounts contradicted the prosecution's suggestion that Marcus had deliberately attacked the guard. James Morrison's appearance as a prosecution witness was a disaster for the Crown's case. Under cross-examination, he was forced to admit that he had been drinking during his duty shift and that he had not disclosed this to investigators. His credibility was severely damaged, and his testimony about the incident was called into question. The expert testimony about crowd dynamics and accidental contact in densely packed tourist areas further undermined the prosecution's case. Experts explained that in the conditions present at Buckingham Palace that day, accidental contact between tourists was not just possible, but inevitable. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the case was about much more than Marcus's actions on that Friday afternoon. It had become a referendum on tourist behavior, military protocol, media responsibility, and the justice system's handling of high-profile cases. Marcus found himself at the center of debates about issues he had never considered before his vacation went wrong. The revelation that James Morrison had been struggling with alcoholism and work-related stress for months before the incident added another layer of complexity to the case. Defense attorneys argued that the guard's reaction had been the result of his personal problems rather than any wrongdoing by Marcus. This portrayal of James as a troubled individual rather than a hero defending British dignity changed public perception of the case. Social media sentiment began to shift as more details emerged during the trial. The hashtags that had once been used to vilify Marcus were now being used to question the fairness of his prosecution. Public opinion polls showed a growing belief that Marcus was being treated unfairly by a system more interested in protecting its reputation than ensuring justice. Marcus's testimony on his own behalf was emotional and compelling. He described his genuine love for London and British culture, his respect for the military and royal institutions, and his horror at how a moment of clumsiness had been transformed into an international incident. His obvious distress and the months of suffering he had endured began to generate sympathy even among those who had initially condemned him. The trial revealed the human cost of viral outrage and social media pile-ons. Marcus's experience demonstrated how quickly someone's life could be destroyed by a single moment captured on camera and amplified by millions of strangers with incomplete information. His case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of rushing to judgment in the age of instant global communication. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides prepared for a verdict that would determine not just Marcus's fate, but also the broader questions about justice, fairness, and responsibility that his case had raised. The outcome would affect how similar incidents would be handled in the future and would set precedents for the treatment of tourists, military personnel, and Viral internet controversies. The jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching their verdict. For Marcus Chun, those 48 hours felt longer than the entire preceding months of legal proceedings. He spent the time in his small bed and breakfast room, unable to eat or sleep properly, alternately hoping for vindication and preparing himself for the possibility of prison. On a gray Thursday morning in November, 5 months after his vacation had begun, Marcus sat in the dock of a London courtroom as the jury foreman stood to deliver their decision. The packed courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read, not guilty on all charges. The relief Marcus felt was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the realization that his legal vindication could not undo the damage that had already been done to his life. As he left the courthouse, facing a barrage of cameras and reporters, Marcus understood that while he was legally innocent, he would never truly be free from the consequences of that day at Buckingham Palace. The verdict was greeted with mixed reactions. Many people celebrated what they saw as justice finally being served to someone who had been railroaded by an overzealous prosecution system. Others argued that Marcus had escaped accountability for disrespectful behavior that would never have been tolerated in any other context. The divisive nature of public opinion meant that Marcus would continue to be a controversial figure regardless of the jury's decision. James Morrison, the guard at the center of the incident, had resigned from the military during the trial proceedings. The revelations about his drinking and previous behavioral issues had made his position untenable, and his military career was effectively over. Unlike Marcus, James received little sympathy from the public once his problems came to light. He became a cautionary tale about the pressures faced by those in highly visible public roles and the importance of seeking help for personal struggles before they explode in public. The documentary filmmaker Sarah Matthews, whose investigation had uncovered crucial evidence in Marcus's favor, won several journalism awards for her work on the case. Her film about the incident, which premiered 6 months after the trial, provided a comprehensive look at how a simple accident had been transformed into an international controversy through a combination of media sensationalism, social media outrage, and institutional dysfunction. Marcus's financial situation remained precarious even after his legal vindication. The months of unemployment and mounting legal fees had left him deeply in debt. His legal team had worked pro bono during the latter part of the trial, moved by the evidence of his innocence, but the damage to his finances was already severe. He faced the prospect of returning to California unemployed and financially ruined. The tech company that had fired Marcus during the proceedings issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging the trial's outcome, but they did not offer him his job back. The negative publicity associated with his case, regardless of the verdict, made him unemployable in an industry that prized reputation and stability above all else. Marcus realized that he would have to completely rebuild his career, probably in a different field entirely. The emotional and psychological toll of the ordeal proved to be the most lasting damage. Marcus had experienced months of constant stress, public vilification, and uncertainty about his future. He suffered from post-traumatic stress symptoms that made it difficult for him to be in crowded public spaces or to handle unexpected attention. The confident, methodical person he had been before the incident seemed to have been replaced by someone more cautious and anxious. Marcus's family relationships had also been strained by the extended crisis. While his parents had ultimately stood by him, the months of worry and financial pressure had taken their toll. His sister had suffered professionally as well, as her association with the case had made her position in public relations more difficult. The ripple effects of that single moment at Buckingham Palace had touched every aspect of his life and the lives of those close to him. The media attention did not disappear immediately after the verdict. Marcus found himself in demand for interviews and speaking engagements about his experience, but he was reluctant to profit from his ordeal. He gave a few carefully selected interviews to legitimate news outlets, hoping to set the record straight about what had actually happened, but he declined most media requests. In these interviews, Marcus emphasized that his case was not really about him personally, but about larger issues of how society responds to viral incidents and how the justice system handles cases that have been tried in the court of public opinion before they reach an actual courtroom. He argued that the rush to judgment that had characterized his case was symptomatic of broader problems with social media culture and 24-hour news cycles. Marcus also spoke about the human cost of viral outrage, describing how his life had been completely upended by strangers who felt entitled to judge him based on incomplete information. He advocated for more thoughtful and measured responses to viral incidents, arguing that the real people behind internet controversies were often lost in the rush to express outrage and moral superiority. The financial settlement Marcus eventually reached with several media outlets that had published false or defamatory information about him provided some relief from his debt, but it could not restore what he had lost. His reputation, his career trajectory, and his sense of security had all been permanently altered by his experience. Marcus decided not to return to California immediately after the trial. The prospect of facing friends and former colleagues who had watched his public humiliation from afar seemed overwhelming. Instead, he chose to stay in Europe for several more months, traveling quietly and trying to process what had happened to him. During this period of reflection, Marcus began writing about his experience. What started as a personal journal gradually evolved into a book about viral outrage, social media justice, and the human cost of internet fame. The writing process was therapeutic for him, allowing him to make sense of his ordeal and to find meaning in his suffering. The book, which was published a year after the trial, became a bestseller and established Marcus as a thoughtful voice in discussions about digital culture and online behavior. While he never would have chosen to become famous in this way, Marcus found that his unique experience gave him insights that resonated with many people who had witnessed similar controversies or worried about becoming victims themselves. Marcus's story became a case study in law schools, journalism programs, and social media ethics courses. His experience illustrated the complex interactions between traditional media, social platforms, legal systems, and public opinion in the digital age. Students and professionals studied his case to understand how quickly situations could spiral out of control and how institutional responses could amplify rather than resolve conflicts. 5 years after the incident, Marcus had built a new career as a consultant helping organizations and individuals manage crisis communications and navigate viral controversies. His firsthand experience with public relations disasters made him uniquely qualified to advise others facing similar situations. While the work was fulfilling, Marcus often reflected on the irony that his greatest professional qualification was having his life destroyed by a cup of coffee. The broader lessons from Marcus's case extended far beyond his personal experience. His story highlighted the need for more careful fact-checking before viral stories were amplified, the importance of considering human costs when prosecuting high-profile cases, and the dangers of allowing social media outrage to drive institutional decision-making. James Morrison, the guard whose career had also been destroyed by the incident, eventually found work as a counselor helping other veterans deal with stress and addiction issues. His experience had taught him about the importance of seeking help before personal problems exploded in public, and he devoted himself to ensuring that others didn't face similar struggles alone. The incident at Buckingham Palace led to changes in how the Queen's Guard handled interactions with tourists. New protocols were established for managing crowd control and for providing better support to guards dealing with the psychological pressures of their highly visible roles. While Marcus took no pleasure in the reforms that resulted from his ordeal, he was glad that his experience might help prevent similar incidents in the future. Marcus never returned to Buckingham Palace during his extended stay in London. The thought of going back to the scene of his life's greatest disaster held no appeal for him. However, he did develop a deeper appreciation for London as a city and for British culture in general. His forced extended stay had allowed him to experience the country beyond the tourist attractions he had originally planned to visit. The coffee cup that had started it all became a symbol used in discussions about viral culture and social media responsibility. Images of similar coffee cups appeared in editorial cartoons and social media posts whenever new viral controversies emerged. Marcus found it surreal that such an ordinary object had become associated with his life story and with broader cultural phenomena. Looking back on his experience, Marcus often wondered what would have happened if he had simply thrown away that coffee cup and continued with his planned itinerary. The butterfly effect of that single decision had reshaped his entire existence in ways he never could have imagined. While he had eventually found meaning and purpose in his new life, he couldn't help but think about the person he might have been if he had just gone to the Tate Modern that day as originally planned. Marcus's story serves as a reminder that in our interconnected world, anyone can become the center of a global controversy at any moment. His experience demonstrates both the potential for injustice when public opinion moves faster than facts, and the human capacity for resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. While Marcus would never recommend his particular path to fame, His journey from viral villain to respected commentator shows that even the most devastating mistakes can eventually lead to unexpected opportunities for growth and contribution. The tourist who threw coffee at a royal guard became a symbol of our times, but not in the way anyone expected. His story is ultimately one of redemption, resilience, and the complex realities of life in the age of social media. Marcus Chen learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can also become the foundation for a different and perhaps more meaningful life than the one you originally planned.